Sudan, a center of one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes in the world. As of January 2024, over 6 million people are displaced, nearly 2 million have fled the country, and the ones who remain suffer from deadly diseases, starvation, and brutality of the conflict between the two main factions. The paramilitary group called Rapid Support Forces, led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, more known as Hemedti, began their violent campaign of gaining power a year ago, in April 2023. Its main opponent is the Sudanese Armed Forces, led by the former dictator of the Sudan Abdel al-Burhan. Both are supported by arms and money coming from foreign actors, and both are prepared to do whatever it takes to remain in power. In the past, Sudan has always been an epicenter of armed violence. After gaining its independence in 1956, the country has already experienced more than 15 military coups. Democracy is something that the people of Sudan have hardly experienced, with military juntas being in power for most of its history. It is exactly because of an armed power struggle that paramilitary organizations were continuously formed in the country. Some faded away over time, and yet there is one that stayed and only grew in power over the last 2 decades. Back in 2003, when the country was ruled by the military strongman Omar al-Bashir, Sudan's western Darfur region rebelled against the government. To suppress the rebellion, Omar decided to use unprecedented violence. He formed a paramilitary group called Janjaweed that was meant to be disintegrated from the regular Sudanese Armed Forces and used as a tool to brutally put down all the opposing population in Darfur. The Janjaweed group became infamously effective in achieving Omar's goals. The initial phase resulted in approximately 300,000 dead, with the events of that year being labeled as Darfur genocide. Afterward, instead of dissolving the loyal Janjaweed hitmen, Omar decided to reorganize the group under a new name. In 2013, the group became known as Rapid Support Forces, shortly RSF, and was placed under the command of Hemedti. Omar saw RSF as his informal bodyguards who would do any dirty work required, and thus he was increasingly invested in their development and expansion. In 2017, a new law gave the RSF the status of an independent security force, giving it additional credibility and authority within the country. RSF commander Hemedti received several gold mines in Darfur as patronage from Omar. This made Hemedti's personal resources grow so much that soon he was already up to the challenge of fighting for the power himself. It was around this time that the first links between RSF and the Russian Wagner Group began to appear. Omar allowed this cooperation, viewing Russian influence as an opportunity to only further consolidate his power. He cut a weapons deal with the Kremlin and instead gave them rights over 50% of Sudanese gold mines that were the critical part of the Sudanese economy. Without realizing it, however, by bringing in Russian weapons, Omar drastically increased the military potential of RSF, whose leader had ambitious plans of his own. In 2019, Hemedti openly rebelled against his former master and ousted Omar's government, establishing a new military junta. Because of the pressure from the foreign states, the junta did not last long, and already the same year a new joint civilian-military unity government was established, with plans of renewing the election process in 2023. Sadly, this was doomed to fail. Another uprising in 2021, this time led by the Sudanese Armed Forces leader Abdel al-Burhan, in cooperation with Hemedti, led to a firm consolidation of power at the hands of the military. Sudanese Armed Forces, shortly SAF, made a joint junta government with RSF. As one would expect, the cooperation between the two power-hungry generals was unlikely to last. Prior to the eventual escalation, UAE emerged as another supporter of RSF in addition to the Wagner Group. The United Arab Emirates reportedly provided the Rapid Support Forces with weapons, armored vehicles, and drones via neighboring Chad. By one count, there were 168 airlifts from the UAE between May and September last year. It is important to note that the UAE's support for RSF is part of their rivalry with Saudi Arabia, which is reported to take the side of the Sudanese Armed Forces. Currently, Much of that African region is divided between the spheres of interest of two prominent actors in the Arab world. UAE's bloc includes Sudanese RSF, Ethiopia, Chad, and chunks of Somalia, while Saudis have SAF, Egypt, Eritrea, and Djibouti under their wing. Tensions between the two groups in Sudan continuously escalated until in 2023 the country reached a point of no return. On 11th of April 2023, Hemedti deployed his soldiers in the capital of the country, Khartoum, which shortly led to armed clashes with the Sudanese Armed Forces. In the following days, a mass mobilization began all across the country, with Sudan entering into a full-fledged civil war. Without any established frontier, the fighting was happening in every corner of the country, from the region of Darfur to the port of Sudan. The initial success was on the side of RSF. Russian weapons and personnel helped Hemedti win over a huge part of the country and get close to gaining total control of the capital. At this point, something largely unexpected happened. The involvement of Russian soldiers in the conflict prompted Ukraine to perform a series of operations in Sudan, targeted at eliminating Wagner units. Collaborating with the Sudanese Armed Forces, the Ukrainian government sent several operatives to Sudan, whose goal was to find and kill Russian mercenaries. This was an opportunity for President Zelensky to weaken Russian presence worldwide and disrupt their huge supply of gold. Another reason was to replace the SAF leader al-Burhan, who had previously quietly supplied Ukraine with weapons after the start of the full-scale Russian invasion. Ukrainian operatives executed a series of successful operations, taking down multiple Wagner officials, and shortly withdrew from the country without a single casualty. However, Ukrainian involvement was marginal, without any chance of playing a serious role in shifting the balance of power. With that, already after a year of fighting, the country is divided roughly in two. The army holds sway in much of the east, but the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces controls much of the west. In the meantime, the civilian population is the one that suffers the most. Intense fighting and fear forced millions of people out of their homes and brought many to the brink of starvation. Mass atrocities were committed by both sides of the conflict, and yet were most severe when it came to the RSF. Execution of prisoners, mass rape, and destruction of whole towns are all part of the tactics used by Hemedti forces. One of the most brutal fighting is happening in Darfur, which RSF, formerly known as Janjaweed, are most familiar with. Massacres were reported in multiple towns, with mass graves being discovered all over Darfur. It is hard to monitor the total death toll, but just in Darfur alone, it is estimated to be in tens of thousands. In the capital Khartoum, in the meantime, the majority of the civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and other public buildings, is destroyed. Almost 12 months of pitched hostilities have left the country's economic and political center an unrecognizable shell. The war led to over 6 million displaced and another 2 seeking refuge in neighboring countries, which in turn might lead to another set of humanitarian catastrophes. Countries on the Sudan's border have no economic ability to intake such a large number of people and themselves suffer from violent paramilitary groups. One of the most recent developments in attempts to resolve this conflict is in negotiation talks led by the United States and Saudi Arabia. Nonetheless, both the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces do not seem to show any interest, with both sides believing in their inevitable military victory. Previous negotiations have failed, as the warring factions have not upheld any attempted ceasefire agreements. The latest one, scheduled for the 28th of December 2023, was postponed, with every other diplomatic effort failing one after the other. The question of whether the conflict can be stopped in the near future remains open, with the scale of humanitarian catastrophe getting worse every single day. The latest efforts at helping Sudan include calling on the United Arab Emirates to stop weapon supplies to the RSF, with the UAE refusing to acknowledge that such shipments even exist. Trying to find good in this conflict is the task of hard completion. Both sides have violated human rights, committing numerous war crimes. Both have no intention of ending the military rule and bringing in democratic reforms. With that, the United States, which has the ability to heavily influence the outcome of this war, is hesitant to become increasingly invested, and it's really hard to blame them. The rule of law and order in every corner of the world continues to fall apart, with the future as uncertain as it has ever been.